She lived for 52 years after him. 52 years of silence so dense, so deliberate, so architecturally constructed that journalists from London, Paris, Tokyo, and New York all walked away from her door with nothing but the polite ghost of a closed expression on their faces. Valentina Ivanovna Gagarina, the widow of the most famous human being who ever lived, never gave a single interview after 1978. Not one, not even when they offered her sums of money that could have bought entire apartment buildings in Moscow. Not even when the Soviet Union itself collapsed into dust and the old rules theoretically ceased to apply. Not even when her husband's name was carved into monuments on 6 continents. She said nothing. She remembered everything. And when she finally died on the 17th of March 2020 at the age of 84, the world published a brief, respectful announcement and moved on. The space agency Roscosmos posted its condolences. Flowers appeared at the museum 2 kilometers from where she had lived out her final decades. The same museum she'd never once entered, not once in 52 years, 2 kilometers away. Ask yourself, what does a woman know about a place that makes her refuse to walk through its doors? What does a wife understand about a legend that she cannot bear to stand inside it? The letter arrived inside a sealed envelope, no date on the outside, no name of the sender. Just a line of handwriting in blue ink, careful and unhurried, the kind of handwriting that belongs to a person who has chosen every word with the full weight of consequence. Yura did not die in the sky. They killed him much earlier. The daughters, Elena and Galina, found it among their mother's possessions in the weeks following her death. It was tucked between 2 unrelated documents in the kind of placement that felt less like accident and more like instruction. Valentina Gagarina had been a woman of precision. She had survived half a century inside one of the most surveilled environments in human history. Star City, the closed cosmonauts township outside Moscow, where neighbors reported on neighbors and the telephone lines hummed with the quiet industry of state-end monitoring. She did not misplace things. She did not make careless choices with paper. The envelope was sealed, written across the front in that same careful hand, "Open only after my death." The daughters opened it. What they found inside, 5 documents, a photograph, and a diary entry from March of 1968, will be the final destination of this story. But to understand what those documents mean, you first need to understand the 52 years that preceded them. You need to understand who Valentina was before the state decided what she was allowed to be. You need to understand what kind of man Yuri Gagarin was before he became a monument. And you need to sit with a question that no official commission, no declassified archive, no presidential press conference has ever satisfactorily answered. Why were the full results of the investigation into Gagarin's death marked absolutely secret and signed by Leonid Brezhnev himself? Why did the Kremlin veto a new inquiry in 2007, not delay it, not postpone it, explicitly veto it, with government officials stating they saw no reason to examine the death of their greatest national hero? And why on the morning of the 27th of March 1968 did Yuri Gagarin come home before his training flight, something he almost never did, and hold his wife for what she would later describe in that sealed diary as an unusually long time? Let us begin where all real investigations begin, not with the death, but with a life just before it started to be managed. The official story of Yuri Gagarin is one of the cleanest, most perfectly assembled biographical narratives of the 20th century. Son of a carpenter and a dairy farmer from the Smolensk region, born in 1934 in a village so small it barely registered on regional maps. Grew up during the war, survived occupation, discovered aviation, applied to flight school on what seemed like impulse, and rose through sheer aptitude, discipline, and the particular radiance of a personality that made everyone in a room feel personally noticed, to become the first human being in history to leave the planet Earth and return. On the 12th of April, 1961, Yuri Gagarin spent 108 minutes in orbit. He came back. The world went mad with joy. Nikita Khrushchev embraced him on the tarmac. Crowds in Moscow were so dense that people climbed lampposts and scaffolding just to see the car carrying him through the streets. Within 48 hours, he was the most recognizable face on the planet. That is the official story. Clean, luminous, sealed. But here's the first crack in the lacquer. Valentina Gagarina learned about her husband's spaceflight from the radio, the same way everyone else did. No one from the state, from the cosmonaut program, from the committee, no one came to her door the night before to say, "Your husband launches tomorrow morning. He may not come back. You should know." She was sitting in their apartment in Star City when the announcement came through the speakers. She heard his name. She heard what he had done. And within hours, not days, men arrived at her door, not in uniform, in civilian clothes. They sat in her kitchen, they placed a document on her table, and they gave her instructions. How to dress for the cameras, what expressions to make, what questions to deflect, what subjects to never approach. She was 25 years old. This is not speculation. This is what she told the small number of people she trusted in the small number of unguarded moments that 52 years of careful living occasionally produced. Her last interview, given in 1978 to a Russian journalist, the final one she ever gave, contained a sentence that her editors at the state publication softened almost beyond recognition. In the original transcript, she said something that translates roughly as, "From that morning, I understood that my life had a different purpose than I had imagined." A different purpose, not a grander one, not a prouder one, a different one. Now consider the strange geography of her later years. After Gagarin's death in 1968, Valentina was relocated, officially as an act of governmental care, a gift of proximity to her husband's memory, to a residence in Zvyozhny Gorodok, Star City. The Gagarin Museum stood 2 kilometers from her front door. His flight suit was behind glass. His letters were framed. Children came in school groups every week to stand before the artifacts of her husband's greatness. She never walked through those doors, not once, not in 52 years. When her friend, one of the rare people who had access to her true feelings, asked her why, she reportedly answered with a sentence that contains everything this story is about. "There is no truth about my Yura in there. Not, it is too painful. Not, I cannot bear to see his things." Those would be the answers of grief. The answer she gave is the answer of knowledge, the answer of a woman who knows what is on the other side of a door and has decided with full deliberation that she will not legitimize it with her presence. Pardoned in the autumn, following her death, when her daughters sorted through the accumulated documents of a long, quiet, watchful life, they found 3 things that did not fit the official image of Valentina Gagarina as a devoted, grief-stricken, politically loyal widow. The first was a notebook filled with names, dates, and brief notations, the kind of record a person keeps when they are tracking something and do not trust their memory alone. The second was a set of photographs taken in the week before the 27th of March, 1968. Gagarin in them looked not like the icon on the posters. He looked like a man preparing for something. The third was the envelope. And on the outside of the envelope, in Valentina's handwriting, those words that cut through 52 years of enforced silence like a blade through paper. Yura did not die in the sky. They killed him much earlier. What does that sentence mean? It does not mean what it might first appear to mean. It is not a statement about the plane crash on the 27th of March. It is something far more specific, far more devastating, and far more difficult for the official record to absorb. To understand it, you need to go back to 1957, to a city called Orenburg, to a 19-year-old nurse named Valentina Goryacheva, who had not yet learned that falling in love with the wrong man, or rather, the right man at the wrong historical moment, could cost a person everything that a person is. That is where the real story begins. If you already feel that something about the official version of Gagarin's life doesn't add up, you are not alone. Thousands of researchers, aviation engineers, and historians have felt the same thing for decades. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what was in that envelope will change how you understand not just one man's death, but the entire architecture of Soviet heroism. There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears the face of romance. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with warning signs or visible machinery. It arrives the way all the most consequential things arrive, quietly, in an ordinary moment, in an ordinary place, wearing the expression of something beautiful. And by the time you understand what has actually happened to you, the door behind you is already closed and the key is in someone else's pocket. Valentina Gagarina was 19 years old in the autumn of 1957. She was working as a medical nurse at a military garrison in Orenburg, a flat, wind-scoured city in the southern Urals where the steppe begins and the horizon goes on forever in every direction. She was the daughter of a factory worker and a school teacher. She was not a political person. She did not think in terms of the state or power or ideology. She thought in terms of her patients, her shift schedule, the letters she wrote home to her mother on Sunday evenings, and the specific quality of the light in October when it fell across the garrison courtyard just before dusk. She was, by every account that survives, a person of uncommon steadiness, not flashy, not performing, just genuinely, quietly present in every room she occupied. Yuri Gagarin was 23. He was a cadet at the Orenburg Higher Air Force Pilot School. He was 5 feet 2 inches tall, a height that would later prove cosmically convenient since the Vostok capsule had been designed with very little margin for a larger body. And he had a smile that people who encountered it remembered specifically for the rest of their lives. Not because it was the smile of a handsome man, though he was handsome enough. Because it was the smile of a person who was genuinely glad to see you. Who made you feel, in some inexplicable way, that your existence had improved his day. He came into the medical unit complaining of a wrist injury. Whether the injury was real has never been established with certainty. What is established is that he came back 3 times in the following 2 weeks with variations of the same complaint, and that on the 3rd visit he asked Valentina if she would like to attend a dance at the officers' club on Saturday evening. She said yes. This is the version in all the official biographies. Warm, uncomplicated, inevitable. The kind of meeting that feels in retrospect like it was always going to happen. The cosmonaut and the nurse, the dreamer and the steady one. It has the clean geometry of a fairy tale. But fairy tales, as anyone who has read the originals knows, have a great deal of darkness in the architecture. They married on the 7th of November, 1957. The date was not accidental. It was the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, a day of public celebration and patriotic display. For 2 young people with no particular political ambitions, it was simply a convenient holiday. For the state apparatus that would later manage every aspect of their public existence, the date was a detail that could be woven usefully into the national mythology. The cosmonaut married on Revolution Day. Even the love story was, without anyone consciously planning it, already aligned with the symbolic calendar of Soviet power. But before the wedding, and this is the detail that Valentina mentioned to at least 2 people in her lifetime, in those rare, unguarded moments, a man came to see her. Not to see Yuri, to see her. He was Major. He wore the uniform of the Soviet Army, but the insignia on his collar indicated an attachment to a department that was not the ordinary military structure. He sat across from Valentina in the garrison office and asked her questions about her family. Her father's employment history, her mother's political affiliations, if any, her own membership or non-membership in various organizations, her contacts outside the garrison, whether she had any relatives who had been abroad or who had expressed opinions that might be characterized as, he used a specific word she remembered, unreliable. The interview lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, he thanked her, stood up, straightened his uniform, and left without explanation. No one told her what the interview was for. No one told her whether she had passed or failed some invisible assessment. She simply went back to her shift, finished her work, and 3 weeks later married Yuri Gagarin in a small ceremony with their immediate families present. She would not fully understand the meaning of that 40-minute conversation for several more years. But the meaning was this. From the moment Yuri Gagarin was identified as a candidate of particular interest to the Soviet space program, which happened earlier than the official record acknowledges, and at a level of institutional attention that was never disclosed to the candidates themselves, every person in proximity to him became a variable to be evaluated, managed, and if necessary, replaced. Valentina had been evaluated. She had passed. And in passing, she had been quietly enrolled in something she had never applied for. The first 3 years of their marriage were, by her own description in the diary found after her death, genuinely happy, difficult. They moved 6 times between 1957 and 1960, following the assignments of a junior military pilot whose career trajectory was still officially unremarkable. She carried their first pregnancy through one of these moves, giving birth to their daughter Elena in April of 1959 in conditions that she described as not what I would have chosen, but we managed. She was 21. She was living in military housing in a city she had moved to 4 months before. She managed. Yuri flew. He was, by all accounts from his instructors and fellow pilots during this period, an exceptional student, not the most technically gifted in his cohort, but possessed of a psychological composure under stress that distinguished him from pilots of greater raw skill. He could sustain focus in conditions of extreme pressure without the physiological symptoms, elevated heart rate, narrowed attention, decision-making errors, that degraded the performance of other pilots. This was noticed. It was noted. It was filed somewhere. In the spring of 1959, Yuri disappeared for 3 months. The official explanation delivered to Valentina through a phone call from his commanding officer was a training exercise, classified location, no communication permitted, standard procedure. She accepted this. She was the wife of a military pilot. Classified training exercises were part of the landscape of her life. But when he came back, she noticed something that she could not name precisely, but that registered with the clarity of a physical sensation. He was the same person, the same voice, the same face, the same way of moving through a room, but there was a quality of distance in him that had not been there before. Not coldness, not withdrawal. Something more specific than that. The particular distance of a person who has learned something they are not permitted to share, and who is now permanently carrying a private weight that cannot be set down. She asked him once directly. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "There are things I know now that are better for you not to know." She did not ask again. In retrospect, in the light of everything that came later, in the light of what was found in the envelope, that sentence was not a deflection. It was not the vague, self-important privacy of a man who enjoyed the mystique of classified work. It was a specific warning delivered with genuine care from a man who already understood, 3 months into whatever he had been recruited into, that proximity to this particular knowledge was a form of exposure, and that exposure could be dangerous. He was 25 years old. He was trying to protect her. The second pregnancy came in 1960. Their daughter, Galina, was born in March of that year. Yuri was away for much of the pregnancy. He came back for the birth, stayed for 2 weeks, and then disappeared again into the machinery of a program that was racing with the full urgency of Cold War competition toward a goal that had never been attempted in the history of human civilization. Valentina was 22 years old. She had 2 daughters under the age of 2. She was living in a closed military township where the social structures were organized around the requirements of the program, not the needs of the families. The wives of cosmonauts and pilot candidates formed a community of careful mutual support. They shared childcare, they shared information about schedules and availability, they shared the particular solidarity of women whose lives had been organized around the ambitions and assignments of men in service of something larger than any individual family. They also, all of them, shared the habit of not asking questions that would not receive honest answers. The morning of the 12th of April, 1961 came to Valentina the way it came to everyone else in the Soviet Union, through the radio. She was in the apartment. The girls were there. She heard the announcement, the formal, slightly breathless voice of the state broadcaster, the specific cadence that Soviet citizens had learned to associate with events of historical weight. She heard her husband's name. She heard the word space. She heard orbit. She heard 108 minutes. She sat down. Within hours, the apartment filled with people she had not invited and did not know. Officials from the space program, representatives from various committees, a woman whose function was never clearly explained but who, Valentina would later note, seemed to know the apartment's layout before she entered it. And the men in civilian clothes, always in civilian clothes, never in uniform, as though the absence of insignia created a legal ambiguity that was somehow useful to everyone involved. They sat in her kitchen, they placed papers on the table, and they began, with the efficiency of people who had clearly done this before, to explain to Valentina Gagarina who she now was. She was the wife of a hero of the Soviet Union. She was a symbol of the strength and warmth of the Soviet family. She was evidence that the Soviet system produced not only technological triumph, but human happiness. She would be photographed, she would be interviewed, she would smile in certain ways and speak in certain registers and deflect certain questions with a specific set of prepared phrases. She was 25 years old with 2 daughters under 2, and her husband was still in space. She nodded. She signed what they put in front of her. She smiled for the first round of photographs that arrived with the cameras within 48 hours. And somewhere in the part of herself that she had learned in the 3.5 years since that 40-minute interview before her wedding, to keep very quiet and very still. She understood that the woman she had been before that morning no longer existed in any publicly accessible form. That woman, the 19-year-old in Orenburg, with the October light in the courtyard and the letters home to her mother, had been replaced by a role. The role had her face. The role had her name. The role would stand beside the most famous man in the world at state dinners and public parades and photographic sessions for international magazines. But Valentina herself, the real one, the one with the diary, the one with the sealed envelope, the one who would later stand outside a museum 2 kilometers from her front door and turn around without going in, that Valentina had already begun the long, careful, precise work of becoming invisible, not because she was broken, because she was strategic. And strategy, as the next decade would prove, was the only form of survival available to a woman who knew too much about the wrong things. Fame came like a flood, and floods, as anyone who has survived one knows, do not distinguish between what they carry and what they destroy. In Part 3, how the most celebrated marriage in the world became the loneliest prison in the Soviet Union, and what Gagarin himself said in a moment of unguarded honesty about the 108 minutes that made him a god and ended his freedom forever. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only exists at the very top. Not the loneliness of isolation, of empty rooms and silent phones. That loneliness, at least, has the honesty of its own appearance. The loneliness that Yuri Gagarin entered after the 12th of April, 1961, was the other kind. The loneliness of being surrounded at every hour of every day by crowds of people who were responding not to him, but to the version of him that the state had constructed, laminated, and placed on permanent public display. He was present in every room, and he was alone in every room because the person in the room was not the person anyone was actually seeing. He tried to explain this once to a close friend from his pilot training days. a man whose name appears in no official biography and who gave his account decades later in the careful, still watchful manner, someone who had spent a lifetime being careful and watchful. Gagarin said something that this friend remembered word for word, the way you remember sentences that arrive with the weight of something true. Before the flight, I was a person. After the flight, I became a function. And the worst thing about being a function is that no one notices when the person inside it starts to disappear. The world tour began almost immediately. In the months following the flight, Gagarin visited more than 30 countries. He went to London, where crowds lined the streets in the rain, and he waved from an open car with that specific smile, the one that made everyone feel personally noticed, while the KGB officers assigned to his delegation counted faces in the crowd and filed reports. He went to Paris, where he was received with a fervor that surprised even the French, who are not easily surprised by celebrity. He went to Cairo, Helsinki, Tokyo, Havana. He shook hands with kings and prime ministers and factory workers and school children. He was, by any external measurement, the most celebrated human being on the planet. At home, in the apartment in Star City, where Valentina was raising 2 daughters, mostly alone, the telephone rang with requests, summons, scheduling notices, and logistical instructions. Valentina became, in practice, a single parent who was also required at irregular intervals and with minimal advance notice to appear as half of the most famous married couple in the Soviet Union. She would receive a call. She would dress in the approved manner. She would travel to wherever the approved photographer was waiting. She would stand beside Yuri, who sometimes seemed, in the brief private minutes before the camera started, like a man surfacing from a very long dive, filling his lungs with ordinary air before going back under, and they would perform the tableau of the Soviet ideal family for whatever publication needed it that week. Then he would leave again, and she would go home to the girls. Elena was 3, Galina was 2. They knew their father from photographs. What the official record describes as Gagarin's active social life during the post-flight years is, when examined with the specific attention it deserves, something considerably more complicated. He drank more than was acknowledged. This was an open secret within the cosmonaut community and the broader military aviation world, a fact that was managed, suppressed, and occasionally deployed as a control mechanism by the people responsible for his public image. When he drank, he became not aggressive, not erratic, but honest. And honesty, in a man who knew what Gagarin knew by 1962, was the most dangerous possible condition. He sought the company of women. The official biographies, the ones published in his lifetime and the ones published under state supervision after his death, either omit this entirely or reduce it to a single vague reference to personal difficulties that were resolved within the family. The reality was more specific, more human, and when you understand the context, more comprehensible than the sanitized version suggests. The first was an actress, a woman connected to a Moscow theater, young, politically unimportant, and therefore, from the perspective of the apparatus managing Gagarin's image, a manageable problem. She was transferred, not fired, not publicly disgraced, simply moved with the quiet efficiency of a system that had long experience relocating inconvenient people. She went to a provincial theater in a city far enough from Moscow that her presence ceased to be relevant to anyone who mattered. No announcement was made, no explanation was offered. She simply was no longer there. The second was a translator, a woman attached to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who had been part of the delegation during one of the international tours. Intelligent, multilingual, professionally accomplished. She was removed from her position within 6 weeks of the relationship being noted in the surveillance reports that, it is important to understand, were filed on Gagarin with the same regularity and detail as they were filed on any Soviet citizen of strategic value. She did not disappear. She was simply no longer in any room that Gagarin occupied. The third case is different in kind. Her name, in the documents that have partially surfaced over the decades, appears as Anna Tikhonova, an instructor attached to a sports and recreation facility in Sochi that members of the cosmonaut program used during rest periods. She was 26 years old. In the summer of 1966, she fell from the balcony of a fourth-floor apartment in Sochi. She survived the fall. In the spring of 1967, 11 months later, she died. The official cause of death recorded in her medical file was cardiac insufficiency. She was 27 years old. No investigation was opened. No questions were publicly asked. The case existed in the official record as a tragic medical footnote, a young woman with an undetected cardiac condition, a private death, a closed file. Her name does not appear in any biography of Yuri Gagarin. After the third case, and it is impossible to know whether the sequencing was coincidental or causal, whether the machinery of the state was responding to events or creating them, something shifted in Gagarin's institutional status. The tours slowed. The public appearances became more controlled, more supervised. The gap between one event and the next filled with what was officially described as political education sessions and program reintegration. In practice, what this meant was that Gagarin was no longer moving freely. He was being supervised with an intensity that went beyond the standard management of a state asset and into something that looked from the inside like confinement with a public-facing interface. For approximately 6 months, the exact dates are blurred in the available record, which is itself a form of information, he gave no major speeches, attended no international events, appeared in no new photographic material. The existing photographs of him from this period, the ones that survive in private collections and were not part of the official state archive, show a man who looks tired in a way that sleep cannot affix. Not ill, not broken. Tired in the specific way of a person who has been in a sustained argument with reality for long enough that the effort of maintaining the argument has become its own exhausting condition. He met with party representatives regularly. The meetings were described in the internal memos that have partially declassified over the decades as ideological consultations, the word used in the Soviet bureaucratic vocabulary for these meetings. Prophylactic, carries in its clinical neutrality the full weight of what they actually were. Structured sessions designed to remind a man of the precise dimensions of the space he was permitted to occupy and the precise consequences of attempting to exceed those dimensions. He sat in those rooms, he nodded, he signed whatever was placed in front of him, and then to a close friend, the same friend from pilot training, in one of those unguarded conversations that happened rarely and were remembered permanently. He said the sentence that Valentina would later record in her diary, the diary found with the envelope, the diary that her daughters would open in 2020. That flight became my prison. I went up free and I came down someone else's property. And the worst thing, the very worst thing, is that I cannot even explain to Valia what kind of prison it is, because explaining it would put her inside it too. Valentina, of course, was already inside it. She understood this with the clarity of someone who had been living in the structure long enough to have mapped every wall, the telephone that she warned guests not to speak freely beside, the visitors who arrived in unremarkable clothing and sat in her kitchen asking questions that were framed as friendly conversation, the routes she had learned to take, the doctors she had learned to see, the shops she had learned to use, the entire domestic geography of her existence arranged around the principle of minimizing exposure while appearing to any external observer completely ordinary. She had, over the course of 7 years, become extraordinarily good at being invisible while standing in plain sight. But here's what the official narrative, with its clean surfaces and its careful omissions, consistently fails to account for. Valentina was not passive. She was not enduring. She was not simply absorbing what was done to her and the man she had married with the mute suffering of a woman who had no other options. She was watching. She was recording. She was with the slow, meticulous patience of someone who has learned that the only timeline available to them is a very long one. Building something, an archive, a testament, a sealed envelope with 5 documents inside it and a sentence on the front that would take 52 years to reach the people it was addressed to. By 1967, Gagarin had been grounded from active flight for nearly 2 years. The official reasoning was administrative. His symbolic value to the state made the risk of losing him in a training accident unacceptable. He was too important to fly. Which meant, in the language Gagarin himself used in private, that he was too important to be allowed to do the one thing that had made him feel like himself. He pushed for reinstatement. He argued, he lobbied, he leveraged every relationship he had built in the cosmonaut community and the military aviation hierarchy. And in the autumn of 1967, he was granted permission to resume flight training. Not full operational status, a gradual reintegration, supervised, controlled, with a senior instructor present in the aircraft. The senior instructor assigned to fly with him on the 27th of March, 1968, was Vladimir Seryogin, an experienced and respected pilot. The flight was a routine training exercise. The aircraft was a MiG-15 UTI, a 2-seat trainer, a standard workhorse of Soviet military aviation. They took off at 10:30 in the morning. 11 minutes later, the aircraft disappeared from radar. The wreckage was found in a forested area near the town of Kirzhach. The impact crater was 3 meters deep. The aircraft had struck the ground at near vertical angle at full speed with no evidence of any attempt at ejection. Both pilots were killed. The official investigation, conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy and signed off by Leonid Brezhnev himself, concluded that the most likely cause was evasive maneuvering to avoid a foreign object, possibly a weather balloon, that had caused the aircraft to enter an unrecoverable dive. The full investigation report was classified not for 20 years, not for 30, for 75 years. And on the morning of the 27th of March, 1968, before he went to the airfield, before he climbed into the aircraft, before the 11 minutes that ended everything, Yuri Gagarin came home. He almost never did this before training flights. It was not his pattern, not his habit, not consistent with the logistical rhythms of a morning flight preparation. He came home, he stood in the apartment, he looked at his daughters. Elena was 9, Galina was 8, and he held Valentina for what she would later describe in 3 words in the March diary as, "Too long." He knew. Then he left. Valentina stood at the window and watched the car until it turned the corner and was gone. She would spend the next 52 years with the weight of those 3 words. Too long. He knew. There are accidents, and then there are events that wear the clothing of accidents. The difference between the two is not always visible from the outside. In fact, the most consequential distinction, the one that separates a genuine tragedy from a managed one, is precisely the degree to which the event looks like an accident. A real accident is messy, inconsistent, full of the random noise of circumstance. A managed event constructed by professionals with institutional resources and long experience is clean. The edges are smooth, the paperwork is filed correctly, the witnesses are relocated before anyone thinks to ask them questions. The death of Yuri Gagarin on the 27th of March, 1968 is one of the most extensively investigated aviation incidents in Soviet history. Multiple commissions, hundreds of witnesses interviewed, thousands of pages of technical analysis, decades of subsequent inquiry by independent researchers, aviation engineers, and investigative journalists from a dozen different countries. And yet, after all of it, after every commission and every analysis and every declassified fragment, the official conclusion remains, in its essential structure, the same uncertain formulation it was in 1968. Most likely an evasive maneuver, probably caused by a foreign object. Consistent with an unrecoverable dive, most likely, probably. Consistent with. These are not the words of certainty. These are the words of a record that has been managed. The morning began in a way that everyone who was present noted, and that no one in the official investigation waited appropriately. Gagarin arrived at the Chkalovsky airfield in a state that his ground crew described in the testimonies recorded within 48 hours of the crashes. Unusually focused, not tense, not anxious. Focused in the specific way of a person who has made a decision and arrived at a particular kind of internal stillness that comes after the decision, not before it. He completed his pre-flight checks with Seryogan. He signed the flight documentation. He exchanged brief words with the ground crew. He climbed into the aircraft. One member of the ground crew, a mechanic who had worked on the aircraft the previous day and had cleared it as fully operational, watched the MiG taxi toward the runway and said something to a colleague that the colleague remembered and repeated to a journalist from a regional newspaper in 1993, 25 years later. The mechanic said he looked like a man going somewhere he'd already decided to go. The mechanic himself was not available for further interview. He had died in 1971. The circumstances of his death were recorded as a workplace accident at a different facility in a different city 3 years after the crash. This is the first anomaly. Flight lasted 11 minutes from wheels up to the moment the radar track disappeared. 11 minutes is a very short training flight. The scheduled duration of the exercise was between 20 and 30 minutes. No radio communication from the aircraft indicated any technical emergency, any navigational problem, any request for guidance or assistance. The last radio transmission from the aircraft was a routine position report from Gagarin in the calm, measured voice of an experienced pilot doing exactly what experienced pilots do during routine training flights. After that transmission, silence. The aircraft did not respond to subsequent radio contact from the airfield. No distress signal was transmitted, no ejection was attempted. The ejection seats in the MiG-15 UTI were functional and had been confirmed operational in that morning's pre-flight inspection. The aircraft struck the ground at a near vertical angle, at a speed consistent with full throttle, with both pilots still in their seats. The lead air traffic controller on duty that morning, the person responsible for managing the airspace in which the MiG was operating, filed his incident report, gave his testimony to the initial investigation commission, and within 4 months had been reassigned to a posting in a remote region of the Soviet Far East. He had spent his entire career in the Moscow Military Aviation District. He had no disciplinary record. He had not requested a transfer. The reassignment came through channels with the correct paperwork and was described in the internal documents as a routine rotation. He never returned to Moscow aviation work. This is the second anomaly. The medical commission assembled to examine the recovered remains faced a task that was, by the admission of its own members in later years, extraordinarily difficult. The impact had been severe. The identification process relied heavily on documentary analysis rather than physical examination. The commission's findings were finalized in a period of time that several independent aviation accident investigators, reviewing the timeline decades later, described as unusually rapid for the complexity of the case. The findings were sealed, not the summary. The summary was released in controlled form to the Soviet press within days, confirming the deaths and attributing them to the aircraft incident. The full findings, including the detailed forensic analysis, the technical examination data, and the complete record of the commission's deliberations, were classified. The senior medical officer who led the commission gave one interview in 1989 to a Soviet journalist working during the brief openness of the Glasnost period. In that interview, he said something that the journalist's editor removed before publication, but that the journalist preserved in his personal notes and disclosed in a memoir published in 2004. The medical officer said, "We were told what the conclusion needed to be before we began the examination. Our job was to construct the path from the evidence to that conclusion. We did our job." The senior medical officer died in 1991, natural causes. He was 63 years old. This is the third anomaly. The investigation commission that produced the official report operated under a classification regime that was, even by the standards of Soviet institutional secrecy, exceptional. The commission's membership was not fully disclosed. The terms of reference under which it operated were not published. The witnesses it interviewed were not identified in the public record, and the report itself, the complete report, not the sanitized summary, was sealed under a classification order that specified a period of 75 years from the date of the incident. 75 years, not 20, not 30, not 50, the standard period applied to sensitive state documents of the era. 75 years, which would bring the earliest possible release date to 2043, by which point every person who had been an adult in 1968 would, with near mathematical certainty, be dead. When a group of Russian legislators attempted in 2007 to initiate a new parliamentary inquiry into the circumstances of the crash, arguing that the passage of nearly 40 years and the collapse of the Soviet state made continued secrecy both unnecessary and disrespectful to Gagarin's memory, the proposal was blocked, not delayed in committee, not referred for further review. Blocked explicitly, with a government statement that described the existing conclusions as definitive and expressed the view that a new inquiry would serve no purpose beyond distressing the families of those involved. Both of the families involved had publicly stated that they supported a new inquiry. The government's concern for their distress was, in the circumstances, a remarkable act of institutional compassion. The commander of the regiment to which Gagarin and Seryogin had been attached, a man who had signed the operational authorization for the flight, who had been present at the airfield on the morning of the 27th, and who had given testimony to the original commission, submitted his resignation from military service in 1969. He was 42 years old. He had no recorded health problems. He had no disciplinary issues. He simply submitted his papers, left the service, moved to a small city in the Ural region, and declined for the remainder of his life to speak publicly about the events of March 1968. He was, by all accounts from people who knew him, not a man given to silence. Before the crash, he had been described by colleagues as sociable, direct, and professionally outspoken. After it, he became, in the specific way of a man who has understood something about the cost of speaking, very quiet. This is the fourth anomaly. In the weeks following the crash, the space at Chkalovsky Airfield, where the MiG-15 had been housed, underwent a process that the official record describes as standard post-incident administrative review. The aircraft's technical files, the maintenance logs, the pre-flight inspection records, fuel and systems documentation were transferred to the investigation commission. This is normal procedure. What is less normal is that the technician who had performed the final pre-flight inspection on the aircraft and who had signed the clearance documentation confirming the aircraft's airworthiness was not called to give testimony to the commission until 6 weeks after the crash. In the interim, he had been moved from Chkalovsky to another facility. When he did give testimony, it was in a closed session whose transcript does not appear in any partial declassification that has since occurred. He died in 1970. The cause of death recorded in his official documents was a road accident outside the city where he had been relocated. He was 31 years old. He had no family in that city. He had been transferred there from Moscow, where his family remained. No inquest was held into the road accident. The file was closed within 2 weeks. This is the fifth anomaly. 5 people, 5 trajectories that began in close proximity to the events of the 27th of March, 1968, and ended through reassignment, through resignation, through death, in a pattern that, taken individually, might be attributed to coincidence, to the ordinary turbulence of lives lived inside a complex institution during a turbulent era. But taken together, placed side by side, examined as a set in the way that an investigator examines a set of related data points rather than a collection of unrelated incidents, Taken together, they describe something. They describe the systematic removal of every person who had been in a position to offer testimony that was not controlled. The mechanic who noticed Gagarin's expression, the air traffic controller who managed his final minutes of flight, the doctor who led the forensic commission, the regimental commander who signed the operational authorization, the technician who certified the aircraft's airworthiness, all gone, all silent, all relocated to the geographic margins of a country vast enough that its margins are effectively invisible. There is one more piece. It did not come from a commission or an archive or declassified document. It came from a single source, a man who had worked as an administrative officer at the airfield, a man whose role placed him in the periphery of events rather than their center, and who therefore apparently did not register as a variable requiring management. He immigrated in 1990 after the Soviet system began its collapse. He settled in Germany. He gave a single interview to a Russian-language journalist in Hamburg in 2002, which was published in a small émigré newspaper with a circulation that ensured almost no one read it. In that interview, he described walking past the office of the regimental commander in the early afternoon of the 27th of March, hours after the crash had been confirmed before the public announcement had been made. The door was slightly open. He did not enter. He glanced through the gap in the way that a person glances at something that is not their business. The commander was sitting at his desk, motionless, facing a single sheet of paper. The administrative officer could not read the full text of the document from where he was standing. He could read one line, the line at the top of the page in the larger typeface used for headings and summaries in official Soviet administrative documents. The line read, "Gagarin knew too much. He kept walking. He told no one for 30 years. He told the journalist in Hamburg because he said he was 67 years old and had decided that the weight of knowing was heavier than the weight of telling." The journalist fact-checked what could be fact-checked: the administrative officer's identity, his employment at Chkalovsky, his presence on the 27th of March, all of it verified. The document itself has never been found. But Valentina, in her diary from March 1968, written in the days after the crash, in the shaking handwriting of a woman in the acute phase of grief, wrote a sentence that she then crossed out so heavily that it took her daughter's significant effort to reconstruct it under strong light. The sentence, reconstructed, read, "He told me he had found out something that meant he could no longer pretend I did not know what he meant then. I know now." She crossed it out. She crossed it out because she understood with the precise situational intelligence of a woman who had spent a decade learning to be invisible, that some sentences are safer inside a pen than outside it, but she did not tear out the page. She left it there, in the diary, in the sealed envelope for her daughters to find 52 years later, because Valentina Gagarina was not a woman who destroyed evidence. She was a woman who archived it. The system does not want your suffering. It wants your performance of suffering, controlled, photogenic, politically legible grief, the kind that confirms the heroism of the lost, the wisdom of the state that produced him, and the loyalty of the woman left behind. What the system cannot tolerate, what it will work with quiet and sustained efficiency to prevent, is the other kind of grief, the private kind, the kind that asks questions, the kind that remembers things that were not included in the official account, the kind that sits in a kitchen at 3 in the morning with a diary open and writes sentences that later need to be crossed out so heavily that it takes 2 generations and strong light to read them. Valentina Gagarina understood this distinction within weeks of the 27th of March, 1968. She understood it not because someone explained it to her, but because she had spent 7 years inside the machinery of Soviet heroism and had long since learned to read its requirements without being told. She adjusted accordingly, and the adjustment she made was so precise, so intelligent, and so completely invisible to the people monitoring her that it took decades and a sealed envelope for anyone outside her immediate circle to understand what she had actually been doing all along. The relocation came within 3 months of the crash. The apartment she was moved to was in Star City, the same closed township where she had already been living. The new residence was larger, better appointed, positioned with the particular thoughtfulness of an institution that understands that comfortable confinement is more sustainable than uncomfortable confinement. There was a garden. There were good schools nearby for Elena and Galina. The neighbors were, as they had always been in Star City, a community of carefully vetted individuals whose professional lives were organized around the space program and whose personal lives were organized around not asking questions about it. 2 kilometers away, the Gagarin Museum stood at the center of the township's symbolic geography. His flight suit behind glass, his letters framed, the photographs of his smile reproduced at monumental scale, visible from the road. The proximity was presented in the official communications as an act of honor, a gift of closeness to his memory. The widow of the cosmonaut living in the shadow of his legacy, sustained by the nearness of his story. What it actually was, understood plainly, was a monitoring arrangement. Not crude monitoring, not guards at the door, not visible surveillance, nothing that would create the image problem of a state persecuting the widow of its greatest hero. Sophisticated monitoring, the kind that presents itself as care, regular visits from program administrators checking on her welfare, a telephone line maintained at state expense, and as Valentina became aware within the first year, maintained with additional infrastructure that served purposes beyond ordinary communication. She discovered the telephone monitoring in the way that careful people discover these things, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small inconsistencies, conversations that seemed to have been heard by people who had no business hearing them, questions asked by visitors that could only have been formulated on the basis of private exchanges. A particular quality of the line itself, a slight irregular delay in the connection that she learned to recognize the way a musician learns to recognize a note played fractionally flat. She began warning guests before they used the telephone. Not dramatically, she did not make speeches about surveillance or express outrage. She simply, when a guest reached for the receiver, would touch their arm lightly and shake her head, and then she would turn on the radio, loudly. The radio became one of her primary instruments. After visits from the men in unremarkable clothing, they came with declining but never entirely ceasing frequency throughout the 1970s and into the 80s. She would turn the radio to full volume for a period of time that those who knew her understood as a signal. Not a signal of distress, a signal of completion. The visit had occurred, the performance of cooperative ordinariness had been delivered, and now the performance was over, and she was alone again. And the radio was playing because music, unlike conversation, cannot be mined for information. She developed other codes with similar elegance. The specific shops she visited, always the same ones, always in the same sequence, created a pattern that was, to anyone observing it, the unremarkable domestic routine of a woman of settled habits. To the small number of people she trusted, the pattern communicated her condition. A variation in sequence, a different shop visited first or one of the regular stops omitted, indicated that a visit had occurred and that she was in a period of heightened attention. The restoration of the normal sequence indicated that the period had passed. She never explained this system explicitly. She demonstrated it over years through repetition until the people who paid attention understood it without being told. This is how Valentina Gagarina communicated across 52 years of monitored silence, not through grand gestures or dramatic disclosures, through the geometry of her daily movements and the volume of her radio. She had been a nurse. Nurses understand the body as a communication system. They read vital signs, they interpret the language of physical state. They understand that a person can be saying one thing with their mouth and something entirely different with their pulse. Valentina applied the same principle to her existence inside the surveillance architecture. of Star City. Her surface behavior said one thing, her actual communication said another. And the art she had developed over years of practice was ensuring that only the people who needed to read the second message could see it. The 1970s passed in this way, quietly, steadily, with the particular texture of a life that has been organized around endurance rather than event. Elena and Galina grew up, studied, married. Valentina attended the weddings in the approved manner. Photographs exist, she's smiling in all of them. The smile is genuine enough that it does not read as performance, which was itself a form of professional accomplishment. She maintained civil relationships with the program administrators who visited. She responded to official correspondence with appropriate courtesy. She attended the commemorative events, the anniversary celebrations of the April flight, the memorials on the anniversary of the crash, in the correct clothing with the correct expression, and said the correct things. She gave her last interview in 1978. A Soviet journalist, a woman who had been granted access through official channels and who arrived with a list of approved questions. The interview was conducted in Valentina's apartment. The radio was on at low volume throughout. The journalist's published piece was warm, respectful, and contained nothing that had not been approved in advance. In the journalist's private notes, which she preserved and which were examined after her own death by her family, there is a single entry that reads, "She answered every question correctly. There was not one moment when she was not completely in control of every word. I have interviewed ministers and generals. I have never interviewed anyone more controlled than this woman. She's protecting something. I do not know what. I did not ask." After that interview, Valentina closed the door permanently. No more journalists, no more approved conversations, no more performance of accessibility for the public record. The monitoring continued. The visits continued. She continued to turn on the radio. In 1991, the Soviet Union ended. From the outside, this looked like the moment when all the old constraints dissolved, when the files opened, when the secrets surfaced, when the people who had been silenced for decades could finally speak. And for many people, it was exactly that. The glasnost years and the collapse years produced a cascade of disclosures, memoirs, confessions, and revelations that rewrote significant portions of the Soviet historical record. For Valentina Gagarina, the collapse of the system that had organized her entire adult life produced a different response. The journalists came again from everywhere, Russian, European, American, Japanese. They came with new freedoms and old questions, and in several cases, with financial offers that were, by any measure, extraordinary. One Western documentary production company offered her a sum communicated through intermediaries that would have been transformative by any standard of material comfort. The offer included full creative control over the final product, independent legal representation, and the explicit assurance that no Soviet-era institution had any remaining authority to prevent her from speaking. She declined. Through the same intermediary, without a meeting, without a counter-proposal, her response relayed exactly as she had given it. "I have nothing to tell," and the same 4 words she had been using since 1968. The same words that every journalist, every documentary maker, every researcher had encountered at the end of every approach. 4 words that, depending on how you heard them, could mean either that she had no information, or that she had information she had decided, with full deliberation and complete autonomy, not to share. Every serious researcher who spent time studying Valentina Gagarina's life eventually concluded that the second interpretation was correct. But here's the question that took decades to formulate properly. Why? Not why during the Soviet period. That answer is visible in the monitoring architecture, in the telephone delays, in the men in unremarkable clothing who arrived at her door. During the Soviet period, silence was survival. That's comprehensible. But why in 1991, when the system had collapsed? Why when the files were opening and the old rules had ceased to apply, and no institution retained the legal authority to enforce the constraints that had organized her life? Why did she still choose silence? The answer, worked out slowly by those who knew her well enough to ask the right questions in the right register, was not what the journalists assumed. The journalists assumed fear, a habit of caution so deeply embedded that it continued operating after the conditions that had created it had disappeared. The psychological residue of decades of surveillance producing a reflexive silence that the person inside it could no longer voluntarily override. This interpretation is wrong. It misreads Valentina Gagarina in the same fundamental way that the official Soviet narrative misread her, as a passive recipient of forces larger than herself, shaped and determined by the system she lived inside, incapable of genuine autonomous choice. The people who actually knew her described something entirely different. They described a woman of exceptional intellectual clarity who, in the years following the Soviet collapse, made a series of deliberate decisions about what she would and would not disclose and about the form that her eventual disclosure would take. She had, by 1991, been thinking about the envelope for a long time. She had been thinking about who would open it and when, and what they would need to understand before the contents would mean what she needed them to mean. She had been thinking about the sequence, the specific order in which the documents inside it should be read. She had been thinking with the long-term strategic patience of a woman who had learned to operate on timelines that most people cannot sustain, about the difference between a disclosure that lands and a disclosure that disappears. A disclosure in 1991 would have landed in the chaos of a collapsing state among 1,000 other disclosures competing for attention in a media environment that was simultaneously overwhelmed with sensation and structurally incapable of processing complexity. It would have been published, briefly discussed, disputed, and buried. A disclosure after her death, sealed, preserved, delivered to her daughters, with the specific instruction that it be opened only after she was gone, would arrive differently. It would arrive with the weight of a life's silence behind it. It would arrive as the culmination of 52 years of deliberate, sustained, intelligent restraint. It would arrive as testimony rather than allegation, as record rather than claim. She understood the difference. She chose accordingly. In her final years, as her health declined and the daughters visited more frequently, she said very little about Yuri that was not already part of the public record. She spoke about him in the present tense occasionally, a habit of the long-witted that the daughters understood not as confusion, but as the particular grammar of a love that had never been permitted to end cleanly. She tended the small garden at the apartment. She listened to music. She maintained her roots, her shops, her doctors, the geography of survival that had structured her days for 5 decades, now continued not because the surveillance required it, but because it had become, simply, the shape of her life. The museum stood 2 kilometers away. The flowers at the entrance changed with the seasons. School groups arrived on schedule. She never went. When her youngest grandchild asked her once, with the direct curiosity of a child who has not yet learned which questions are unanswerable, why she never visited the museum of her famous grandfather, she looked at the child for a long moment with the expression that people who knew her associated with her moments of most complete honesty. Then she said, "There is no truth about my Yura in there. Not sadness, not bitterness, just the plain, flat, completely certain statement of a woman who knew the difference between a monument and a man, and who had spent 52 years being the last living guardian of that difference." She sealed the envelope. She placed it where her daughters would find it. She wrote the sentence on the outside in her careful, unhurried handwriting. Yura did not die in the sky. They killed him much earlier. And then she waited, with the patience of a woman who had learned long ago that some truths move on a timeline that outlasts the people who carry them. Some envelopes change everything the moment they are opened, not because of what is physically inside them, paper, ink, photographs, the ordinary materials of documentation, but because of what they represent, the endpoint of a decision made by a human being at a specific moment in their life. The moment when they chose to place something true inside a sealed container and trust that the world at some future point would be ready to receive it. Valentina Gagarina made that decision sometime in the years following the crash. That the exact moment cannot be pinpointed. The diary does not record it. The daughters don't know it. What they know is that when they found the envelope in the weeks after her death in March of 2020, it had the quality of something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time. Not dusty, not forgotten, not accidentally preserved, deliberately placed, deliberately sealed. Deliberately left where it would be found by the right people at the right moment. The daughters sat together at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table in the same Star City apartment where, 52 years earlier, men in unremarkable clothing had sat across from their 25-year-old mother and told her who she was now permitted to be. Elena opened the envelope. There were 5 items inside. The first was a technical document, 4 pages typed on the thin paper characteristic of Soviet administrative production, with a stamp in the upper right corner that indicated its origin in an investigative commission of the late 1960s. It was a partial expert assessment of the MiG-15 UTI involved in the crash of the 27th of March, 1968. The assessment was partial because pages were missing, not torn out, but simply absent. The pagination jumping from page 3 to page 7 with the clinical blankness of a record that has been deliberately thinned. What remained was sufficient to establish one conclusion with complete technical clarity. On the morning of the 27th of March, the aircraft assigned to Gagarin and Seryogin had been inspected, assessed, and certified as fully airworthy. Every system functional, every instrument reading correctly, the fuel load correct, the control surfaces responding within normal parameters. The aircraft had not failed. Whatever happened in those 11 minutes between takeoff and impact, it had not happened, because the machine malfunctioned. This document had never been part of any public release. It had not appeared in any of the partial declassifications that had occurred over the decades since the crash. It existed as far as any public record was concerned in the classified archive, sealed for 75 years, inaccessible until 2043. Valentina had obtained it through means that the document itself does not explain and that her diary does not illuminate. What the diary does say in an entry from some time in the 1970s is this: "I now have the paper that says the plane was not the problem. I will keep it. One day it will matter more than it matters now." The second document was a hand-drawn schematic, not a professional technical diagram, but the careful freehand work of someone reconstructing from memory or from a source they could not copy directly. It showed a flight path, 2 lines, one marked with the notation that translated as filed route, one marked actual. The divergence between the 2 lines began approximately 4 minutes into the flight. The actual route, as reconstructed in the schematic, did not correspond to the training exercise that had been logged and authorized that morning. It deviated from the filed route in a direction that, if continued, would have taken the aircraft toward a specific area of restricted airspace. An area whose designation, marked in the corner of the schematic in Valentina's handwriting, indicated a facility that was not officially connected to the aviation world at all. The daughters recognized the designation Elena in the account she gave to the single journalist she has ever spoken to, a brief, careful conversation that occurred in 2021 and that the journalist has described as the most significant interview of her professional life. Said that when she saw the designation in her mother's handwriting, she understood immediately that it referred to a specific installation that had been, during the Soviet period, among the most classified in the entire program. The installation where, in the years between 1957 and 1961, certain experiments had been conducted whose results were considered sensitive enough to require indefinite classification. The installation where, according to sources that have circulated in the investigative journalism community for decades, without ever achieving the density of evidence required for mainstream publication, At least 3 cosmonauts had died before Gagarin's flight, not after. Before. This is the third document's territory, and it is the one that requires the most care in its handling, because it sits at the intersection of what can be documented and what can only be reconstructed from fragments, testimonies, and the specific silence of archives that will not open until 2043. The official history of the Soviet space program begins its human chapter with Yuri Gagarin on the 12th of April, 1961, 108 minutes. One orbit, safe return. The first human being to leave the planet and come back. The word back is doing significant work in that sentence. The Italian journalist Achille Udica Cordiglia and his brother Giovanni spent the late 1950s and early 1960s operating an independent radio monitoring station in Turin, intercepting Soviet space communications. They recorded signals that they identified as coming from Soviet space vehicles, signals that included, on multiple occasions, what they described as the sounds of human distress, breathing, a heartbeat, a voice speaking in Russian becoming fainter, disappearing. The Soviet Union denied everything. The mainstream Western scientific community treated the recordings with skepticism proportional to their extraordinary implications. The recordings were never definitively authenticated. They were never definitively disproven. They exist in the archive of that Turin monitoring station as one of the most persistent and unresolved questions in the history of the space age. Valentina's third document was not a recording. It was 3 pages of handwritten notes, not in her handwriting, in Yuri's. The notes were undated, but the paper and ink were consistent with the early 1960s. They described, in the compressed, precise shorthand of a man with a technical education, recording things he was not supposed to know, 3 names, a brief notation beside each name, and beside each notation a single word that appeared in all 3 entries. The word was classified. Below the 3 names, in a different ink, darker, suggesting it had been added later, Gagarin had written one sentence: "I was not the beginning. I was the first one they allowed to come back." The 4th document was a photograph, black and white, slightly overexposed in the manner of amateur photography of the era. It showed Gagarin, recognizable, unmistakably himself, sitting at a table with 2 other men. The location appeared to be a private apartment rather than any official setting. The other men's faces were not visible. One had turned away from the camera, one was partially obscured by shadow. On the table between them, papers and what appeared to be a reel-to-reel recording device of the kind used for audio documentation in the Soviet period. The photograph was taken based on the context established by the other documents in the week before the 27th of March, 1968, 7 days, perhaps fewer, before the crash. On the back of the photograph, in Valentina's handwriting, he had decided he was going to tell them everything. These men were going to help him reach the Western journalists. He showed me this photograph 3 days before the flight. He said, "Whatever happens, keep this. Whatever happens." 3 days before a training flight that lasted 11 minutes and ended in a crater 3 meters deep. Whatever happens. The 4th item in the envelope, the diary from March 1968, has already been partially examined in this account. The crossed-out sentence, reconstructed under strong light, in which Valentina recorded that Yuri had told her he had found something he could no longer pretend about. But the diary contained more than that one entry. It contained 17 pages covering the period from the 1st of March to the 25th, 2 days before the flight. And across those 17 pages, in the shaken then steadying handwriting of a woman moving through the acute awareness that something is approaching, there is a portrait of a man in the final weeks of a decision. He slept badly. He ate carefully. She noted this specifically, the deliberateness of his eating, as though he was preparing his body for something. He spent hours at the desk in the evenings writing. He burned some of what he wrote. She smelled the paper, saw the ash in the tray. He kept other pages, folded, in the inside pocket of the jacket he wore every day that final week. He was gentle with the girls in a way that she described as different from his ordinary gentleness. More present, more deliberate, the kind of attention that a person pays when they are aware that time is finite and they are choosing consciously how to spend what remains of it. On the evening of the 26th of March, the night before the flight, he sat with Valentina at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said something that she recorded in the diary, with a steadiness that suggests she had already, in some part of herself, been preparing to receive it. He said, "If something happens tomorrow, it will not be an accident, and you will know that I chose it, and why. And I need you to understand that a choice made for the right reason is not a tragedy. It is the only kind of freedom I have left." She did not ask what he meant. She already knew, because she had read his notes. She knew the 3 names. She knew what the schematic showed. She knew about the men at the table with the recording device. She knew that the information he was carrying, the names of the cosmonauts who had died before him, the evidence of a program built on concealed deaths, the records he had assembled across years of quiet, careful, dangerous documentation, was information that the state would never permit him to deliver. And she knew, with the particular certainty of a woman who had spent 7 years learning to read the difference between what the state said and what the state did, that the moment Gagarin moved to transmit that information to the Western press, he would not be permitted to land safely from any subsequent flight. He had understood this too. And he had made a decision. The 5th and final item in the envelope was a single sheet of paper. Not typed, not formal, not dated. Just Yuri's handwriting in the large, open script that appeared in all his personal correspondence. The handwriting of a man who had learned to write in a village school and never entirely shed the generous letter formation of that early instruction. The sheet contained 2 things. The first was a list of 12 names, 12 people in various positions across the Soviet scientific, military, and administrative apparatus, who Gagarin had identified as knowing about the cosmonauts who had died before him. People who had participated in the concealment. People who had signed the documents that kept 3 deaths out of the historical record. The second was the last line on the page, written slightly apart from the list in the manner of something added after the rest was complete. "Forgive me, Valya. I could not be their monument and also be a man. I chose to be a man." Elena and Galina sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading the final page. The radio was off. The apartment was quiet. Outside, 2 kilometers away, the museum stood with its flight suit behind glass and its photographs at monumental scale and its school groups arriving on schedule. They put the documents back in the envelope. They sealed it again. They have not published it. They have not given it to a commission or a journalist or an archive. They have not confirmed its existence to any official body. What Elena said in that single careful conversation with the single journalist she has spoken to was this: "Our mother spent 52 years deciding how to carry this. We are not going to carry it carelessly." So here's where this investigation ends, not with a verdict. Not with a commission's conclusion or a government's admission or a document released from an archive on a scheduled date in 2043. It ends with a question. Valentina Gagarina spent 52 years in possession of 5 documents that, taken together, suggest that the most celebrated life in the history of human exploration was also one of the most controlled, one of the most surveilled, and one of the most deliberately ended. She chose silence. She chose the sealed envelope. She chose the specific geometry of her daily movements as her language, and the volume of her radio as her punctuation. She never entered the museum. She said, "There is no truth about my Yura in there." And now you have heard what was in the envelope. So the question is not whether the documents are real or whether the names are verifiable or whether the investigation will ever be reopened or whether the archive will unseal on schedule in 2043. The question is simpler than any of that. It is the same question Valentina faced in 1991 when the walls came down and the journalists came with their offers and their freedoms and their assurances that the old rules no longer applied. The same question her daughters faced at that kitchen table with 5 documents in front of them and a lifetime of their mother's silence behind them. If you had been holding this truth, what would you have done with it? Would you have spoken, or would you have understood, as Valentina understood, that some truths are not destroyed by silence, that they are preserved by it? Leave your answer in the comments, because this conversation is not over. It is, if anything, only now beginning. And if you believe that history belongs to the people who lived it, not to the institutions that managed it, then subscribe, because there are other envelopes, other widows, other silences with architecture inside them, and we are just getting started.